Well, this is just a little video on making a horizontal bandsaw stand using the old Harbor Freight lightweight portable bandsaw. It works out good in this application, and it was first posted, I'll put the link below, by Winky using a really novel hinge mechanism. The hinge is essentially a piece of angle iron, and the bandsaw is mounted to another piece of angle iron. It makes a very effective hinge wedge, and it's mounting a small vise on a piece of wood. And in this case, I've added vacuum. I've also compensated for the fact that the vise is not very close to the blade if you set it up originally. The original video had the vise on the other side. It was a different setup. I made that, but then I saw that it had some shortcomings, so this is a modification of that particular version. I'll go over the parts and the fact that it's mounted to this board, and the board hangs on the wall, so it's out of sight, out of mind when I don't need it. I do have a couple of others. I made a vertical bandsaw stand. This is from Outside Screwballs video. It's a Portaband, a Milwaukee, which is really heavy duty. It's really too heavy to lift up, and it may not make the best application for the horizontal saw because it weighs so much. I've modified Outside Screwballs stand to add vacuum because the chips get into the rubber wheels and slip and have an issue. I've also made a metal cutting chop saw out of an angle grinder. This works out well for cutting rebar or something crude. And this vertical setup is fine for closer, intricate work. But when you're cutting something to put onto the lathe, then the horizontal bandsaw is a much better deal. And these two, again, with limited space, these two items get put into a cabinet down below on slide-out shelves when I'm not using them. And the horizontal stand is really unique. So I'm going to take a couple minutes just to show some of the features I've added to Winky's setup in case anyone else has this saw. The advantage is that these old Harbor Freight saws are lightweight. You can get them fairly cheaply for 10 or 20 bucks at secondhand shops or pawn shops. The disadvantage is they've got a very hard plastic tire or wheel in the back. So you need to be careful about chips getting impacted into this hard plastic and then the blade slipping. So this has a couple other parts coming up. This is the advantage of putting the bandsaw stand on a substantial piece of 2x10 is that I could hang it on the wall when I'm not using it. It's out of sight, out of mind. Without a lot of space, I use the wall for all kind of jigs and setups, and I call it wall art. But the saw set up on this board goes onto a bracket on the wall, hangs fairly well, and I can use it when I want to. The other pieces I've made in the past, the vertical bandsaw with the Portaband and this cutoff wheel sit in slide-out stands in this cabinet. And then when I'm done, it's simply a matter of closing it up, and I don't have to deal with things, and I can use the space for something else. But again, this setup with the motor on this side allows it to hang more compactly, and it's actually the weight distribution is a bit better. Well, these are just a couple of modifications to the Winky design at first. Again, I put the saw on the other side of the vise. It allows the blade to come down and you can see it fairly easily. Again, I put a stop block. I enlarged the jaws of the vise, and I added this eye bolt to keep the jaws parallel when you're working on a small piece. I've also added dust collection. I simply hook my shop vac up to the back of that, and it pulls most of the metal chips from the blade when it's cutting. And again, these Harbor Freight wheels, it's a hard plastic glued on tire. It's not the rubber like the Portaband. So the best thing is to keep any of the chips off of the plastic. It gets embedded and then the blade will slip. Now I have added a sort of a safety feature. There's a bolt that goes into this vise or into this piece of angle iron, and it prevents the saw from coming down. There's also another hole down below, and when you put the saw in the down position, you put the bolt in the other hole, and I simply put a nut on it so it keeps it from flopping around when I hang it on the wall. And I, again, used a heavy piece of wood with a handle so I can carry it around. And one thing I found out with this hinge mechanism is that I've used a piece of very thin HDPE plastic. This is one of these cheap cutting boards. And I cut it to the dimension of this 4-inch piece of angle iron. And it makes a very slippery surface. You can bolt or tighten down the hinge bolt to as tight as you can, and it'll still slip because this HDPE is a very frictionless surface. So again, the vise jaws are enlarged. There's an angle bolt or an eye bolt to keep the jaws parallel. There's shot vac, and I painted it up because, again, it was an old Harbor Freight that was pretty cheap because they're not made anymore. They are lightweight, but in an application like this, they work very well. A lot better than the heavy Milwaukee Portaband. This little video clip is simply modifications to the drill press vise that I'm using here. Same one as Winky used. The limitations when you mount the saw this side of the vise is that the distance between the base and the saw blade is kind of large. It's almost 2 inches. So what I've done is I've made larger vise jaws. I've extended the base of the vise, and I've added sort of a turnbuckle to secure the jaws, especially when you're using a short or a small piece, an irregular piece of stock to cut. So the base is extended with a couple of pieces of angle iron that are ground and are the same height as the base. I simply drilled them and tapped them and then screw these two pieces directly into the base of the vise. It provides a flat surface for the stock to sit on. The new jaws are 2-inch by 1/4-inch steel, and I've drilled them and tapped them on the same holes as the original jaws. In fact, the original jaws are still there. The machining on this vise is kind of poor, so that I found it best just to leave the original jaws there and add jaws in front of it. And the last thing is the vise is kind of crude, so I've drilled and tapped on this side for a 3/8-inch bolt, and I have an eye bolt with a little turnbuckle. And then when you secure the piece of stock down, because the jaws are extended, they can lose their parallel nature. So having the turnbuckle over here on this side, you keep the jaws in a parallel fashion, at least well enough to secure the stock. And then I've cut the jaws so that they're fairly close in alignment to the blade as it comes down. So I'm able to cut, if this shows up, a very small piece of stock right where I want to do it. So again, these are modifications to Winky's original design, and I'll put the link down below. I'm just doing this because someone else might have one of these old Harbor Freight bandsaws and not know what to do with it. And because it's a lightweight unit, it makes an ideal horizontal stand. Okay, thank you.